Before we begin, I would like to publicly thank the following organizations for supporting Silicon Valley Reads: the Knight Foundation, the Michael and Alice Parsons Foundation, Cupertino Library Foundation, Los Altos Library Endowment, Pacific Library Partnership, Cisco, Friends of Cupertino Library, Technology Credit Union, First 5 Santa Clara County, Cyber Press, and the Fairmont San Jose. After that whole list, I feel like I can now work for KQED or PBS. Robin Sloan grew up near Detroit and now splits his time between Berkeley and the internet. He graduated from Michigan State with a degree in economics and from 2002 to 2012 worked at Pointer, Current TV, and finally at Twitter in San Francisco, where he worked on media partnerships. Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore is his first novel. Ajax Penumbra, 1969, a short prequel, was released in September. We have 1 hour with Robin. He'll talk about his book, perhaps one of his short stories, and then we will open the floor to questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Robin Sloan.
Thank you for that warm introduction. It is a total delight to be here on this beautiful campus. I've never been down this way before, and I have to say that I'm grateful to Silicon Valley Reads. It's functioned for me selfishly as sort of a magical mystery tour of all these wonderful places that are so close at hand, and yet, you know, you don't always get over to the colleges and libraries of your region unless perhaps you're invited. So thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here in the middle of the day. So I want to do a few things. First of all, it's helpful for me just to get a sense of how many people have actually read the book. That's fantastic. I'm happy to see all those hands. However, the fact that everyone's hand is not raised means I still have some salesmanship to do, and I take that to heart. I am going to read just a little bit of the book, but it's going to be the tiniest taste. I, as a audience member in events like this, as someone who goes to plenty of readings himself, I always get so bored when the author just reads and reads and reads. If you want to have the book read to you, there's an audiobook version. It's fantastic with a real actor. He does all the voices and everything. It's great. So I recommend that. I'm going to read just a taste, though, to kind of set the scene and give you some context. And then I'm actually going to spend most of my time here telling you a different story, one that's related to the novel. It actually sort of grew out of the novel. It's an opportunity I had because of this novel, and I think it's just a story and kind of an experience that's worth sharing. After that, we'll leave plenty of time for questions, and they can be questions about the book, about Silicon Valley, about anything else. You want some advice, some life advice. And then, of course, as Marianne said, at the end, I'll be happy to sign books, and I can answer questions one-on-one then as well. So that's the story. I'll begin by reading, again, just a tiny taste of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore to set the scene, just so you kind of know who you're dealing with here. This novel opens with its narrator and protagonist, a young guy named Clay Janin, unemployed in the city of San Francisco. He had a design job for like 3 months, and then he was laid off in kind of the nadir of the Great Recession. This is 2009 or so, and he's looking for a new job because he's got to pay his rent, you know, and buy his groceries. He's getting pretty desperate. I kept at it with the help wanted ads. My standards were sliding swiftly. At first, I had insisted I would only work at a company with a mission I believed in. Then I thought maybe it would be fine as long as I was learning something new. After that, I just decided it couldn't be evil. Now I was carefully delineating my personal definition of evil. It was paper that saved me. It turned out that I could stay focused on my job hunt if I got myself away from the internet. So I would print out a ream of help wanted ads, drop my phone in a drawer, and go for a walk. I'd crumple up the ads that required too much experience, that was most of them, and deposit those in dented green trash cans along the way. So that by the time I'd exhausted myself and hopped on a bus back home, I would have 2 or 3 promising prospectuses folded up in my back pocket, ready for prompt and professional follow-up. Now, this routine did lead me to a job, but just not in the way I'd expected. San Francisco is a good place for walks, but your legs have to be strong. The city is a tiny square punctuated by steep hills and bounded on 3 sides by water, and as a result, there are surprise vistas everywhere. You'll be walking along, minding your own business with a fistful of printouts, and suddenly the ground will fall away, and you'll see straight down to the water, with the buildings lit up all orange and pink. San Francisco's architectural style didn't really make inroads anywhere else in the country, and even when you live here and you're used to it, it lends the vistas a strangeness. All the tall, narrow houses, the windows like eyes and teeth, the wedding cake filigree. And looming behind it all, if you're facing the right direction, you'll see the rusty ghost of the Golden Gate Bridge. I had followed one strange vista down a line of steep, stair-stepped sidewalks, then walked along the water, taking the very long way home. I had followed the line of old piers and watched seafood restaurants fade into nautical engineering firms, and then finally, social media startups. Finally, I had turned back in toward the city. Whenever I walked the streets of San Francisco, I would watch for help wanted signs in windows, which is not something you're really supposed to do anymore, right? I should probably be more suspicious of those signs. Legitimate employers all use Craigslist. Sure enough, the 24-hour bookstore did not have the look of a legitimate employer. The sign in the window said, "Help wanted, late shift, specific requirements, good benefits." Now, I was pretty sure 24-hour bookstore was a euphemism for something. It was on Broadway, in a euphemistic part of town. My help-wanted hike had taken me far from home. The place next door was called Booties, and it had a sign with neon legs that crossed and uncrossed. But I pushed the bookstore's glass door. It made a bell tinkle brightly up above, and I stepped slowly through. I did not realize at the time what an important threshold I had just crossed. That's all I'll read. Those of you who have read the book know exactly how important that threshold was. It turns out, of course, that the 24-hour bookstore is much more than it appears to be, and it's connected to a mystery that sort of extends forward into the world of technology and Silicon Valley companies, and also far back in history to the very dawn of printing. And our protagonist and his band of friends and allies kind of gets caught up in that mystery. So this is my first novel, my first time doing readings and book signings and being on the radio and doing community events like this. And one of the things that I've learned is that a book can operate sort of like a key. And for the writer, it can open the way into situations and opportunities and spaces, literally like spaces in the world, physical spaces that you wouldn't otherwise have had access to. In fact, places that you wouldn't have ever known existed. So that's what happened to me, and I want to tell the story of one of those places in particular. The place is called the Grolier Club in New York City. I'm actually curious to know if anyone here has heard of the Grolier Club before. Okay. Often there'll be like one person in the back, and if you've heard of it, you're like, yes, I know that place. The people who know the Grolier Club are very excited about it for a very good reason. I hadn't heard of it either, so I'm in the same boat as you. I was invited there actually to do an interview, a newspaper interview, to the reporter's great credit. Rather than arrange for us to have a conversation in a conference room or a coffee shop or, on the phone or whatever, she, having read the novel and, knowing that it was concerned with old books, she arranged for us to meet at this place, the Grolier Club. So what is the Grolier Club? It is a society of bibliophiles, and it's on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, there among all the kind of pale townhouses and the museums. And it doesn't look like much from the outside. You have to kind of know what you're there to see and press on through the front doors. And inside, it looks exactly the way that you want a society of bibliophiles to look. It is all dark wood, all dappled in shadow. They've made modifications to their lighting system so that nothing can rise above, like a low gloom. And those shelves, the dark shadow shelves, are totally covered with old books. And we're talking books that are centuries old. They're really, really, in many cases, priceless volumes. What they do there at the Grolier Club is they collect these books, they restore them, they preserve them, they study them, and then they share them. You know, it is open to the public in a sort of idiosyncratic way. It's one of those things where it's like every third Tuesday, you know, except for leap years or whatever. So they had opened it up on this day, though, for this reporter and I to come inside, and reporter and me, I should say. Not only that, the Grolier Club's librarian had read Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, which is pretty cool, and she had noted its concern with old books, and in particular, she had noted the presence of a real historical figure in this fictional story. If you read Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, you will become acquainted with a guy named Aldus Manutius. If you've studied history or kind of you know about the Renaissance or the dawn of printing, you also learn about Aldus Manutius. He's a real guy, a publisher. In some ways, even now, even though you know he and his colleagues worked 500 years ago, he's still kind of like the most important publisher of all time. He was the one in the era just after Gutenberg to print with mechanical sort of implements Aristotle and Homer and Virgil and Ovid, all the classic. He's the one who kind of ushered those works into the print age. No big deal. So he's in the book. He plays a pivotal role in the plot. I won't say too much more than that because it sort of verges on spoiler territory. But the librarian at the Grolier Club was like, oh, we have some of his books, no big deal. And so she had selected a few from their large collection and set up what amounted to an impromptu exhibition. And so there they were. Before I was going to sit down with this reporter, I had the opportunity to sit down with these 500-year-old books. They were laid out on this big wooden table. They are in a little pool of golden light in the shadows. And it was like, come over and, you know, say hello. This was exciting because I thought I knew a lot about Aldus Manutius. I had read books about this guy. I had read histories of that time. I had seen pictures of these books. You know, you can go online to the websites of libraries and museums and other scholarly institutions, and they've, you know, taken beautiful pictures and they've scanned whole pages. They've scanned whole books, so you can see them that way, kind of on your laptop screen. But I had never seen any in person, and it turns out that it was important to see them in person. And what I saw in person really surprised me. So I want to actually sort of explain or narrate that experience and what I saw, and with luck explain or sort of communicate why it was so surprising. So I sit down, just a few books kind of lined up on these tables. And the first thing I notice, kind of baseline observation, is that they don't actually look old. I had expected these books to have the look of antiquity. You know, I'd expected them to be just all tattered and funky and like sort of Indiana Jones artifacts, you know, sort of out of the crypt onto the table. They didn't look that way. And of course that was in large part because they have been so well preserved and actually well restored. But upon observation, you can tell that another large part is the fact that they were so well made. These books were constructed in ways that make our modern books, our hardcovers and paperbacks, look like pieces of junk. Even the most beautiful books in that bookstore over there. You can just see the palpable craftsmanship that went into these objects. The thick thread, you know, hand sewn across the binding. The paper itself. She opened up one of these books. I wasn't allowed to touch them, but she had the skills and the, you know, gloves, surgical gloves. She opened up these books, and the pages, it wasn't like paper, they were like towels. This material, this thick, almost textile material, and the hard black type sort of stamped into that surface as if embossed. You know, every page had a third dimension. It was truly beautiful. And to see the dark, still just jet black ink smashed into those big sort of pillowy white pages, I don't know, if you had told me that these books that I was looking at had been crafted by some hipster bookbinder in Portland, you know, a year ago instead of by someone in Venice 500 years ago, I probably would have believed you, or at least I would have thought about it for a while. They didn't look old. So that was the first surprise. The next thing was that some of these books, not all, but a few of them, were quite small. When I say they were small, I don't just mean that they were the size of, small paperbacks or pocket-sized books. They were smaller even than the most compact kind of mass-market trade paperbacks that you commonly see today. They were really, really tiny. And, maybe I should have known that. Maybe I should have known that some of these books were small, but it's always hard to kind of tell or determine scale when you're looking at pictures of things on the internet. And it hadn't ever occurred to me that they even knew how to make books this small at that time. So I expressed my surprise. I was like, wow, those are tiny. Like, we don't even make books that small today. You can't really buy that in a bookstore. And the club's librarian explained, oh yeah, this is a big deal. And in fact, these are some of the smallest books ever produced using mechanical means at that moment. This was a new thing. And then she said, with the, I love the just sort of like casual asides offered by the truly erudite. She said, looking over my shoulder, oh yeah, I mean, that book there, that's probably the first time in history that anybody could curl up with Aristotle, which struck me then and strikes me again anytime I really stop to like process that statement. The first time in history you could curl up with X, Aristotle, Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Dickens, whoever, Sloan. The reason it's so striking, especially now, I would say, is that in all the conversation about books and technology, I think we are very accustomed to chalking up curlability on the side of print books, right? That's one of the fundamental characteristics, and I think one of the most fundamentally appealing things about physical books. They're organic, they're human scale, they're personal, they're intimate, you can curl up with them. There was a time when that was new. In fact, this part I did know. Maybe this is why I expected them to be so big. For a long time, for most of their history, before Gutenberg, before Manutius, books were huge. I mean, they were monstrous. And that was partially because the techniques they used just kind of lent themselves to larger objects. But it was actually more because they were so valuable. Their size was like a theft countermeasure. They wanted books to be big because if they were small, they would be way too easy to just like slip into your robe or your cassock or whatever and walk out the door. They weren't actually only large. They were almost always set up like this, like on a sort of a lectern, a standing podium, and this giant book that you'd have to like strain to turn the pages would be actually chained to the lectern. They were very serious about keeping these books in one place. There was no such thing as a lending library for a really long time because the books were so valuable. They were sort of capital owned by institutions, not objects owned by individuals. So I knew that. And so here are these books that I'm looking at from 500 years ago that are literally some of the smallest books ever made. And it's not just that they're smaller than their predecessors, it's that means that implies a whole new way of like relating to words and ideas. And I have to admit, this is where my fiction writer's brain gets the best of me, but I want to believe that in Venice, circa 1500, you could be like walking down some alleyway and you'd see a poster pasted up in the stone. It would say like, just published by Aldus Manutius, Aristotle's Ethics, now with curl-up technology. And people would talk about it the way we talk about those kind of features today. They'd be like, have you tried the new books with the curl-up? Does it work? Is it good? No? Yeah? All right, I'll try it too. That's fanciful, of course. I don't think that really happened. But I do think people thought about it that way. I think it had some of that. It had some of the frisson that Siri and Touch ID and Retina displays and all that stuff has today. So then finally, one more thing that struck me that I was not prepared for. One of these books opened to show its kind of two-page spread, was printed all in italics. The whole text set in that kind of slanty, flowing way of setting type. Command I on every computer, every machine ever these days. And I, of course, am used to using italics for emphasis and for words borrowed from other languages and for like headings and design purposes, all sorts of things, not for setting an entire text in italics. In fact, it was quite hard to look at. That's what I sort of remarked. I said, my eyes, like something about all that text sort of set in that flowing style. It almost seemed to kind of buzz or sort of vibrate on the page. It was very difficult to read. it was also in Latin, so I didn't really have much of a chance anyway, but I just couldn't look straight at it. And so I kind of, again, profess my surprise to the Grolier Club's librarian. And here again, she says, oh yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. That book is probably one of the first few hundred books in history to be set in italics. She goes on to explain that this too was brand new. Italics, the idea of a sloping, sort of flowing way of sort of displaying text was not new. That was actually the way that books looked for a really long time, but that was only because they were written by hand, right? Before Gutenberg, before movable type, books were created by scribes, and it was hugely laborious, hugely costly. I mean, if you had one of those books, you were rich indeed, or you were part of a very rich institution. And people who learned to read those books and learned to, make sense of these ideas and these stories in Greek and Latin, they're used to seeing text displayed in this way. And it was. I mean, you can look up pictures of this, or I'm sure actually find some resources in the library here. It's really beautiful. It's hard to read, but it's beautiful. So that's what people were used to. And then Manutius comes along, and he's setting his books with movable type. And of course, the movable type is at first much more angular, kind of the letter forms that we're more or less familiar with today. You would absolutely recognize them. It looks like a, Times New Roman, a sort of an early ancestor of Times New Roman. And so Manutius, in a way that I think is very sort of Steve Jobsian, was very tuned in to the user experience and what he was hearing from his customers. And one of the things he was hearing was, these books are awesome, we love the fact that we can afford them, and I can own my own copy of Aristotle and make notes in the margins for the first time. It's amazing, but oh, that text, so sharp-edged, so mechanical. It hurts my eyes. So he set his in-house typographer, the guy who actually designed the shapes that they used to print the books, he gave him a project, an assignment, a challenge, really. And the challenge was twofold. It's this guy, Griffo. Griffo got this challenge. Part one, want you to design a new typeface never before seen, in fact, never before considered, that simulates the hand of the scribe. We want to be able to print it using these machines, these presses, but we want it to look as if maybe it came out of a person's hand, slanting and flowing and more organic. Part two, we wanted to use less paper and less ink, because that stuff was really expensive. That was the glass and aluminum of its day. It was the microchips and the memory, and the less of it you could use, the cheaper you could make the books, and that was better for business, and it was also better for Aldus Manutius's objectives. He wanted to make these books smaller and cheaper and more accessible to more people. So that's the project, that's the challenge. Griffo goes away, he comes back, and he's cut out of metal, these beautiful new shapes. So they start to print the books in what's not yet called italics. For a long time, it's just like the beautiful, really cool, almost spooky way that Aldus Manutius makes his books look as if they might be handwritten. It's not for about 100 years, or until about 100 years later, as it spreads and is copied and improved by others and kind of, goes to other places in Europe, other hubs of the nascent printing trade, that people start to call it the italic type or the italics. And of course, today it's just italics. Okay, that was a big-time typographical digression. But the point, the reason it's noteworthy, and the reason it blew my mind then, looking at this book set all in italics, one of the first ever, is that italics is literally the most boring thing. If you work in design or web design, or if you make applications, if you create things for computers, italics is table stakes. I mean, this is something that every word processor and word processing program, and even many typewriters, have been able to do for a really long time. It is not exciting. It is just a baseline sort of feature, a baseline expectation of modern graphic design, modern typesetting. But there was a time, this book proves, this 500-year-old book proves, there was a time when it was brand new, when it was truly high-tech and truly surprising. So that surprised me. So looking at these books, and considering these revelations together, the fact that they were obviously so well made. I mean, they looked like just beautifully made machines built from really stunning sort of materials that have stood the test of time. They were, some of them at least, were small and portable and intimate in a way that none of their sort of precursors had been. They ushered in a new, more personal way of relating to words and ideas and media. You could put them in your pocket. I actually don't know if they had pockets, but whatever, pouch or cape. But they were personal and intimate. And then they were truly high-tech. And that's not like a metaphorical thing to say. This was literally the coolest, newest, most exciting technology with all the implications that that carries, you know. It was economically important. It was a big business. I think, you know, people were, again, my imagination gets the best of me, but I want to believe that people were lined up, you know, camping out around the corner on the eve of the release of the new book from Aldous Manutius. All the bloggers were writing about it. So I consider all these things together, and it hits me. It's kind of obvious now. I'm looking at the iPhone of 1500. And I mean that in a pretty literal sense, as literal as possible, in fact. Not as sort of a, you know, a metaphor like, oh, consider, what if it was like that? I really think, and this is where, you know, I'm not a historian. I am a fiction writer who has read a lot about this stuff and thought a lot about it. But you can decide for yourself whether you want to believe me. I think that these books filled the role in that time that phones and tablets and all this new technology fills in ours. And of course I mean that economically and culturally and sort of all that in all those serious ways, but the piece I'm more interested in and the piece that actually sort of struck me most strongly there in the Grolier Club is I think they're very similar in the way that they operate in our individual heads and hearts. I think that some people, at least, back in Venice in 1500, felt the same sense of excitement and techno-lust about these new books from Aldous Manutius that some of us, at least, feel today about, you know, new tablets and new phones and video game systems and things like that. I really believe that, I mean, I don't know, maybe there are people in this room who don't feel that. I will speak for those of us who do. There's something very strange about it, something very strange and powerful, almost sort of magnetic. You know, you have the new device or you get to look at it and you just kind of go, right? There's some real lust there. Maybe that's not healthy, but it's real, like it or not. And I believe that people felt the same way. I think they were excited in the same way about these books in this time. So, cool. Why is that interesting? Why is that worth repeating? Why is that story worth communicating? I think it's worth communicating, whether you agree with me or not, for the following reason. The theme of this year's Silicon Valley Reads is books and technology, friends or foes. And it's a good theme. You know, it is a great framework for conversations. You can build lots of programming around it. You know, it kind of gets people talking. However, it's a good theme. However, I also think it's fundamentally misstated. And that's because it says books and technology. And that implies that books and technology are two separate things. In fact, I believe, especially having seen these amazing artifacts there in the Grolier Club, that books are technology, and they always have been. And if we've forgotten that, it's just because we've gotten used to them, but that's our problem, not books. Books never stop being technology. And if you think about them that way, if you think about them as 2 points on a continuous line and not, you know, two separate trains kind of careening through history that just now in the year 2014 are finally colliding, of course not. It's been the same train. It's the same set of tracks from 1515 to 2014. And if you think about it that way, I think you actually just get to have more interesting conversations and you end up having more interesting ideas. It becomes not about, you know, Kindle owners on this side of the room, people who have a library card on that side of the room, fight. It's not this like Thunderdome, you know, showdown between these two formats, and instead it's a recognition that technology is not some strange intruder in the bookstore or the library. It's actually been there all along from the very beginning. The story of books has never not been the story of technology, and we have other technology today, right? And there's going to be more coming, but it's actually all one big thing. And in a lot of ways, all these instances, all these points on the line have done the same things in our economy, in our culture, and I would contend also in our hearts and in our minds. Books are gadgets, and they always have been. So that's the story I wanted to share. You know, the practical takeaway perhaps is anytime you see a, you know, op-ed in a newspaper or some kind of panicky article in a magazine or on a website that frames things this way, like, oh, books and technology, what are we going to do? I feel like it's sort of just an inoculation. Your blood pressure automatically just kind of drops many points because you go, books are technology. They always have been. So with that, having thoroughly defanged this program's premise, I'd be happy to take any questions about that, about all this minutiae and life in 1500, about Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, or anything else. And I think we have a microphone to pass around if people do have questions. So what you got?
Hi, and thank you for being here. So we read with my class your short story, The Wrong Plane. May we ask a question about that?
Yeah, of course.
And I encourage my students to do so as well. So the character in The Wrong Plane is told that if he exhibits any signs of fear, that he will die upon landing. And I'm wondering if there's a larger message you're alluding to. Why that stipulation on the character?
That's a great question. I should back up for folks in the room who don't know the story, The Wrong Plane. This is a story that's free to read on my website. It actually has some very real kinship with Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, because this novel also began as a short story, and it was written in sort of the same period that I wrote The Wrong Plane. There was this year when I had returned to fiction writing, and I was just writing more and more short fiction, almost as cross-training, you know, just to kind of get back into the habit. So The Wrong Plane was actually written on a plane. It was a part of a bet, part of a challenge, actually. See if I could write a complete short story in the time it took to fly from SFO to JFK on Virgin America. So, you know, give or take 6 hours. And it was, in some ways, the best and worst plane ride of my life. And you know, if anything, I feel like I should make it clear at the top. I should sort of have a little disclaimer that says that, because I think knowing that I was on a plane makes everything that follows a little more comprehensible. Because of course I'm not afraid of flying, but I mean everybody thinks about, like, doesn't everyone think about having a plane crash at least once on a plane flight? Of course. So that's part of the experience, right? You're sort of that grim imagination of, like, okay, I'll have a Diet Coke. Oh, what's on the in-flight entertainment system? Wow, man, if that engine exploded, I would be the first to go. And so I think it might actually be as simple as that I was thinking about my own, you know, inevitable mid-air demise. And so, of course, that made it onto the page. And I thought, that is the great challenge on a plane, isn't it? To just chill out. What else?
Hi. There's a lot of information about Google in your book, and I wanted to know how much of that was real.
Right. Google. So I should say that this is not a documentary depiction. This is definitely not all 100% accurate, and I wasn't trying to be. You know, I wasn't trying to put the real Google onto the page here. I would call my depiction of Google in this novel an affectionate exaggeration, and I think, you know, I think some Googlers might disagree, although I've heard from plenty that have kind of nodded their heads, you know, sagely. I think it's a fair representation. I think it gets the spirit of the place right, and many of the things are, you know, it's sort of things that are real Google projects, and I've either sort of reassembled them like Lego bricks, or I've perhaps turned the Willy Wonka meter up just a little bit, you know, to have a little bit of fun with it. But I think it's true to the spirit of the place. Google is, I think, truly unlike any of its peers. You know, there are plenty of other big technology companies that are doing great stuff, and they're exciting places, and there are smart people that work there. But Google, I think, as an outside observer, almost uniquely is a science fictional place. I mean, it is a place with truly science fictional objectives, and they're very upfront, actually, about those objectives. I find that quite exciting. Other people find it, you know, creepy, disturbing, and generally worrisome. I come down on the side of exciting, though. What else?
So in your short story, The Wrong Plane, what was the name of the island when he finally landed? I can't remember it.
Saint Entropy.
Yes, so entropy. What was the significance of that? That kind of represents like calmness finally, or entropy, like everything's at ease.
Yeah,
so what
well,
were you going for?
Well, that's a great question, because it's such a little grace note, right? And actually, the plane was literally landing, you know, the first announcement had come on, and I was going to have to put my laptop away soon, and I was kind of rushing to finish it. And I can actually remember working on the very end of the story and deleting that a few times, then putting it back in and deleting it and putting it back in. There's an alternate universe version of the story where it never really states where he has ended up. It's a little more open-ended and ambiguous. For whatever reason, and this is the honest answer, you know, you have to be careful when writers can explain everything too well with too much precision. I think that often means that they're lying, or they made up the explanation after the fact. The truth is, part of it, of course, was fanciful, and just it occurred to me and it sounded right. But entropy, I mean, you are right that it means ultimately, or I guess I should say entropy leads to calmness, because everything is sort of flattened out. But the process along the way, I think, you know, some people call it chaos. It's like a messy room is full of entropy, actually. It's not the clean, perfectly set up classroom that has entropy. It's the one with everything in disarray and kind of spread around, and some of the chairs are tipped over, and there's, you know, gum wrappers in the corner and cobwebs and a foot of standing water. That's entropy. And I felt like that had a sense of almost danger to it. Like he's not landing in I don't think that the protagonist of that story landed in a resort town. That was not some place where he was going to get a pina colada and get to sit on the beach. I think there were darker things waiting, interesting things, but darker things waiting on the island of Saint Entropy. But who knows?
In your short reading, Wrong Plane, there's this part where the flight attendant sounding like speaking something that sounds like mixture of Japanese, Russian, and crickets. And I was wondering what kind of language you had in mind to refer to it as. It sounded like those languages.
Yeah, that's a great question. What would that possibly be? Right, I do. It's a throwaway line, but it's one of my favorite lines in that whole story, and actually in many things that I've written. The language she was speaking sounded like a cross between Japanese and crickets. And I have to say, I think this is the great power of fiction versus, say, a movie. If this was a short film, right, The Wrong Plane, the short film, I would have had to make that real. I would have had to have someone like invent a fake language. I would have had to get a sound producer to create some crazy thing and like maybe stitch things together, and you would have actually had to hear it. I would have had to make it concrete. With fiction, you can cheat. You can leave it open-ended and essentially create things that are maybe hard to imagine or even impossible to imagine, but you kind of just plant them in a reader's brain, and it sounds different for different people. So I left it exactly like that. In my head, I don't know that I can even quite hear it, but I just know that I like the idea of what that would be, Japanese and crickets.
So, So for this, did you have a particular language in your mind, or
No.
was it like?
I definitely did not have a particular language. It was I would call it a certain ambiguity that, again, I think it's, I mean, frankly, if you want to make the big bucks these days, you ought to like write a TV show or write movie scripts. And if you want to have a huge audience, you got to do those things. Why would a person write fiction? And I think one of the reasons is you get to play tricks like that. I didn't have to have a language in mind. I could just describe it and leave it to other people's imagination to fill it in.
Question to ask relating to The Wrong Plane. What's up with the phrase, the bird is still a bird? Is it a reference to the song Surfing Bird?
That's really funny. It is not, although, of course, this is important. I don't know if you guys have had discussions like this in class, but I believe that after a certain amount of time has passed and a certain amount of distance has been established, the author's own reading of their story doesn't have any more or less merit than a reader's reading. Like, an author in time just becomes another reader of a story. That's what I believe, at least. I'm sure there are some writers who would kind of violently disagree. Therefore, the answer is no, but maybe? I mean, sure. Maybe that's what it is. That's not what I had in my head, but if that is actually, if there's some resonance there that I didn't know about, but it is, let's say that half of all the people who read it sort of sense that association, then practically speaking, of course that's what I meant.
So basically, the phrase is an asinine phrase.
An asinine phrase?
It's just random, inane. It's just there for the sake of being there.
Well, I think it's there in the same way that any words are there. They're all considered, but they don't necessarily have to be references to other things.
I'm saying, like, is there anything in depth or any sort of meaning behind it?
I definitely believe it's true. I think there's something that's very true about the idea of a set of components or ingredients that even if they get, disassembled or torn apart or they take different routes to get somewhere, there can still be such a thing as a coherent identity. There's something called the ship of Theseus that I won't explain now, but there's this old, I'll bet Aristotle had conversations about the ship of Theseus. It's this old question of identity and, like, do the parts of a thing really constitute the thing? And so if you insist on some deep, sort of classical grounding, then I would say that it's probably a nod to the ship of Theseus.
Okay, that's understandable.
I have an overall question about your writing, and it's like, what feeling do you get out of it? Like, is there any purpose for your writing that you want to express to your reader or something?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's manifold. I think for most writers, it's kind of a combination of things, but for me, there is one kind of overriding interest, and it's present both in the things I like to read or enjoy reading the most, and then also in the kind of stuff I read or the kind of stuff I write. I am very interested in the moment that we live in now. I'm also interested in history, but I'm not as interested in history. I'm interested in just this question of the zeitgeist. Like, what is happening right now? Like, what is the spirit of the age? And sometimes you can put your finger on it, and sometimes it's a little more elusive. When I read books that try to do that, William Gibson is a sort of fiction writer. He actually coined the term cyberspace way back in the day. And he does that. His books are some of my favorite because you read them and you just have this sense. To me, it's a thrilling sense. It's almost like I don't know. It's just so sort of visceral and exciting of understanding, if only for just a fleeting moment, the time you live in. You're like, I get it. Okay, that's where we are. We have located ourselves. And then, of course, time rushes onward and there's technology and crazy things happen and there are revolutions and you have to write a new novel to capture it. So that's what's most interesting to me. I feel like if someone reads one of my books or one of certain short stories, if they close it and feel, okay, that's right now, I understand it a little bit better, then that would make me overjoyed. I feel like I would have accomplished what I set out to do.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, same short story. The quote, it's always gate 13, it's never not gate 13. Is there significance to the 13? Is it just because it's like an unlucky number, or?
Yeah, it's a few things. More broadly, I'm always vexed by choosing numbers in books. I mean, it relates to our conversation earlier about, do things have a meaning or not. I want everything to have some meaning, to be chosen for a reason and not just chosen randomly. But often, there are just numbers everywhere, like the address of a place or the number of stories a building has or whatever. And I'm always stumped by it. I'm just like, oh man, is it 20 feet away? That's kind of random. Why isn't it 22 feet away? Is it 36 feet away? And so basically my fallback is, if nothing else, I like to choose prime numbers because I think prime numbers are more interesting than, normal odd or even numbers. And so 13 is a prime number, right? It's only divisible by 1 in itself. Prime numbers are just kind of cool. They have cool mathematical properties, and they always seem like weird numbers. Like 43, it seems obviously like a strange number. It's prime. And then of course it's also unlucky. Yeah. So I think that was just a case where I knew it had to be some gate, and if it was going to be gate 10, that was boring. If it was going to be gate 12, that was boring. But something about gate 13 isn't boring. At least I don't think so.
I have a comment for you, Robin. I feel like I could be Mr. Penumbra's very, very much younger sister. I love Mr. Penumbra. I love the fact that when you first started reading the book, all you thought was this old guy who just cared about old-fashioned print books. That's all he cared about, all dusty books, the Wayback Machine book, the Wayback books. Mm-hmm. And then you suddenly walk into his private office, the upstairs of this tiny little bookstore, and you find all of these old computers like Ataris, IBM mainframes, even an acoustic coupler. And for you guys who don't know what an acoustic coupler is, Google it. That's how we used to surf the pre-internet days. Anyway, what I would like to know from Robin is every Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, I get the same question for the last 5 years. Your career is going to be gone any day now. Libraries are a thing of the past. There are some libraries now that don't even have old-fashioned print books. And I say to them, I think we still are needed because of this technology, because of the fact that so much has happened, and librarians are the ones, in many cases, that are actually taking people to that next level. And I would like to know from you, what do you think will happen to libraries?
Starbucks will own them all. No. Oh, that would be so sad. That's tragic. You know this, of course, having worked in libraries. I think the great counterpoint to all those stories, people tell them about newspapers, and news organizations as well. People tell those stories about publishers. They tell them about music labels, everything. If it's been around for, more than 20 years, and if it's sort of familiar or traditional in some way, then it will soon be destroyed by the internet. And it misses the fact that none of those things were ever static. It's not like libraries were exactly the same for the last 100 years, and only now are they faced with some new shift in the economic and technological and cultural landscape. Libraries have always been changing. I mean, you know this, and the same is true of newspapers, and the same is true of publishers. They've never not been changing, and the changes might be, in fact, coming a little faster, and so they might have to kind of, change their metabolism, increase their metabolism to make sense of them and kind of integrate them, but they will. Of course they will, because they've been doing it for decades, centuries in some cases. I'm quite bullish. That doesn't mean that everything is going to stay the same, and that these spaces are going to look exactly the same in 20 years or 50 years. But of course they're going to be around. It is the rare institution or, format that actually disappears. There are some, we don't have 8-track tapes anymore. Please pour one out for the 8-track player. But radio, we still have radio. We still have newspapers. The business of newspapers is very different, but we're going to have newspapers and things like them for a long time, and we're going to have libraries and things like them for a long time. Easy.
That's what I like to hear. Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. I think I saw one here. Yes.
What are you working on now, or what kind of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's next? I'm working on another novel, and trying to, I think do what a lot of people do, which is maintain some of the things that other people liked, and the things that I liked in the first one, but also do more than just write a sequel or write more of the same. You always want to be modulating it somehow or kind of pushing out into new terrain. So yeah, I'm just hard at work. I'd be typing away now if I wasn't standing here. So yeah.
Robin, you're sitting in your office at Twitter. Your parents are very proud of you. I don't know if you're one of those new IPO millionaires, and you call them up and say, I'm going to throw it all away and I'm going to write a book, or perhaps you were writing at the time. One of the challenges that we face is working with students is follow your passion. So that's what you're doing. What was it? You were sitting at Fort Barrel and said, you know what, I'm gonna do this.
Impressive knowledge of San Francisco fancy coffee establishments. Actually, I don't like the coffee at Fort Barrel very much. It's too fancy. They don't roast it enough. So actually, here's what I did. I think this is worth kind of relating in medium detail. I was working at Twitter, and I had started this book because I'd written this short fiction and done some other small projects totally on the side, all in my spare time. And I decided I wanted to take this one short story and expand it into a full-length novel. The way fiction works, unlike nonfiction, with nonfiction you propose a book and get paid and then have to write it, which is good in some ways and bad in other ways. It's like basically a giant homework assignment that ends up driving people crazy. Fiction, you don't get paid until you finish it, which is cool because you're like, oh, I'm done with the book and I got paid. But it also means that it's very speculative. You embark on a fiction writing project, maybe you're not going to finish it. Maybe no one's going to like it. Maybe no one's going to buy it. But I did embark on that project, and I wrote the lion's share of this novel while I was working full-time at Twitter, more than full-time at Twitter. And I did it in the evenings and the weekends. And I literally took vacation time to sit down and, rather than go and visit my family or go to fun places to do fun things, my vacation was at my kitchen table just typing away. And so it was after I finished that, and actually, in fact, after I sold it, that I decided I was going to try my luck at doing it all full time. Yeah, I think it's important. I think it would have been incredibly stressful and quite scary to kind of make that leap without even the assurance that I, had something to work with. I don't think I would have actually. So, I'm a big believer in artists with jobs. Artists with day jobs. I know a lot of other artists of many different media, illustrators and painters and musicians and writers who kind of agree. There is a point, and it's lucky to be in the position where you can do it full time, but that usually doesn't come for quite a while. Cool. Well, that's a fantastic question. Okay, one more. We'll sneak in one more, and then wrap up.
As a graphic designer myself, I have to say how much I really appreciated all the little insights in your book, from the books themselves to the printing to the typography and all the little hidden meanings about Silicon Valley and the OCD behaviors and all that stuff. So I found it a very, very humorous and entertaining book. And I remember very distinctly the first night that I was reading it, and I put it aside. And I turned out the lights. And then I turned over a few minutes later, and I realized this book is glowing in the dark. I have to ask you, I notice that your shirt is a very similar color palette to the book. Does it glow in the dark, too?
No. I wish. Why aren't I wearing glow-in-the-dark clothes right now?
Can you tell us a little bit about
how? Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, it's it's funny. I'm always happy and also a little bit sad to reveal that. Happy, of course, because it's amazing that the book's cover glows in the dark, and I can't take any credit for the idea. It was the book's designer at FSG, a guy named Rodrigo Corral, who had the awesome idea to pay a little extra for the fancy radioactive ink. And I'm always a little bit sad at the same time because, of course, it's fun when people discover it on their own. And I tell you, the most fun emails I get are the ones, and there are plenty of them, with sort of very strange late night timestamps, like 3:13 a.m. or 4:32 a.m. And it's always someone saying, "I got up to go to the bathroom, and what's going on with this book? So yeah, the book's cover glows in the dark. It's good. And honestly, it's great. That means if you like it, you can enjoy it and appreciate its specialness. And then if you don't like it, you can still use it as a nightlight or to sort of, find your way to the bathroom. It's a good buy either way. So with that, I will thank you so much for your time and attention.